everyone, welcome to our special video on the rubric. This is the part of module 3 that we punted to this asynchronous video. So this is all about how to guide the conversations, weigh the various KSAs in order to debrief through those lenses and anchors after you've done an interview. So it's really a tool that, and Katrina's brilliance has like tied all of this stuff together and helps to guide conversations that many times are just like free for alls. Like, oh, how do you feel about this? Oh, yeah, I had a good feeling, or I think so. And so as you'll see in the rubric conversation, there's like some real beauty in this tool. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So this is really Katrina, over to you on the rubric.
Awesome. Thanks, Tim. I think you've touched a little bit on why a rubric, but I just want to dive a little bit deeper in that. And part of this is in our quest for consistency, we found that an assessment rubric was really useful because it, first of all, guides committee members through specific questions for each candidate in light of the role. So this isn't necessarily like, I really liked them, or they were funny, or all of those kinds of things. But when you think about those KSAs, those key anchors, the kind of values, characteristics, kind of thought leadership that role might need to have, it really helps to have some consistent questions. So the rubric, offers a standardized framework to ensure that you're assessing each candidate in a consistent way. And the other function of it is it's actually a way, possibly if you haven't used one before, that the hiring committee actually experiences an alternative to a traditional debrief or a traditional way of working through that. So this is something new. It can feel like it is extra on top of, and so you may experience some resistance to kind of filling it out and referring to it. You can decide as you move through whether those are pieces that the lead of the search wants to have people submit back so that you have that record, or whether you bring that into conversation and sort of trust that everybody's everybody's used the process and work with it in that way. So again, there's a bit of a bespoke approach, but really the goal is to help everybody stay focused on what's really important in the role and how those things are showing up within that candidate experience of the interview. The reason that the way that we have worked with this is we've actually asked people to share their scores, but not necessarily their comments. So not necessarily sort of their notes underneath or their evidence, but we've drawn that out in the conversations following the interviews. And so we get a chance to look at the scores individually, aggregate them and bring them together. And then we were able to use that to help us with reference points to ping our memories or our observations that were tracked on those rubric forms. So there's lots of ways you can choose to use this. So there's basically 4 different types of rubrics, and really 2 of these are ones that we would recommend for a hiring process. So the first one is a holistic rubric. And so it's really useful because it offers a single scale, and all the criteria that you're looking to learn about in the interview are considered together. So this might be scoring criteria out of the same number of points. Each criteria or each KSA that you're testing in that first interview, for example, you might score that on a scale of 1 to 5, and then have an opportunity to give some evidence or some commentary about that. And then at the end, you'd say, we had these 3 KSA areas or these 3 key anchors we were testing for. And so each of those is scored out of 5. The total score weighting for that candidate is out of a 15-point tally. And so you would use sort of the same type of scale as you move through, and then add those together, and that would be your total. The analytical rubric is really useful for determining where candidates are or maybe are not successful in meeting the position requirements. And you can actually assess the importance of those. You can weigh them differently. And so, for example, if the scoring is out of 100% with different components weighted differently in the long run, we might say that having certain knowledge is the most important and worth 50% of the total weighting, whereas an ability to perform a skill or actually kind of do a task is actually only weighted at 10%. And so that way you're getting sort of relative ratings for each of those different things you're trying to assess, and able to have a different way of weighting those candidates in the long run. I'll just mention here a couple of other different rubrics that you may find useful throughout sort of a search process, and that we wouldn't necessarily recommend for the interview process. So those are checklists and developmental rubrics. So a checklist we kind of think might be more suitable for an onboarding kind of a piece. So from the organizational side, it's what needs to be done to make sure that you're ready to welcome that new employee when they start work. What information um, do they need accessible when they begin? What kind of access do they need? Do they have their equipment? Are they set up properly? All of those kinds of things that will help ensure that when that employee lands, they aren't struggling or wrestling with how to get that information so that they can actually start to dive in. On the candidate side, or on the new employee side, a checklist could also be really valuable to help them be able to respond to any initial questions or actions that you might need them to do. And so they might need to collect a certain kind of information for themselves in order to register for their benefits or weigh in on some of the different pieces that you might need them to. They might need a high kind of high level bio maybe that speaks to them and their role, or they might need to work with a marketing team um, for the release or announcement of their appointment. And so there are ways that you can use a checklist just to help make sure you're getting all of those things down and then really preparing for that new employee and that new relationship. Developmental rubric might be more suitable for performance reviews. And so if you have a conversation, and we'll get into this a little bit more in our conversation about onboarding, but if you have the KSAs or those key anchors, and there are areas where you're really acknowledging that there's some developmental work that candidate might need to do, you might set up a developmental rubric to help identify where those learning curves are. And that might help you then assess, how do we support this employee, or how do we support the organization in helping to make this match a success. Okay. So when we're thinking about rubric design, specifically for those holistic and analytical rubrics, there are three basic things we want to pay attention to. So the first one is to identify the criteria that you want to pay attention to and to actually track going forward. So if you remember the key concepts for the role, that list of brainstorming questions we asked you to do that highlighted, how might we ask questions to help understand the KSAs? How might we ask questions to help us understand those key anchors or other concepts? And then we had asked you in that weekly challenge, to think about theming or sorting and identifying some kind of a pattern or way through that you could identify a focus for the specific interview. So when we did the Upper Philadelphia search, we focused the first interview on assessing the three anchors of the position. So those became our criteria. We were really most curious in that first interview to learn about the candidate's personal connection and experience that related to opera, the arts, or the city of Philadelphia. We were really interested in exploring the in-depth understanding, expertise, and practices in anti-racism, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And we were on the third, really interested in learning about their in-depth understanding, experience, and practice in HR environments. So we selected questions that would help us to be able to weigh those criteria. So the second thing that we look at in rubric design is actually selecting that rating scale to weight the candidate responses to the criteria. So this is where you or the committee might have a conversation around, what is most important? Is there sort of a hierarchy of importance in the things you're trying to learn, or are they, equally important for your ability to kind of consider whether that candidate moves forward? So if they're all equally important, you may opt for a holistic rubric. If there is a hierarchy of importance, you would probably go for one of those analytical rubrics that we just mentioned. So for Upper Philadelphia, we used a holistic rubric. Each one of these anchors was seen to be of equal importance in the long run. So each member of the committee assessed each candidate on a scale of 1 to 5 for each anchor. We asked the committee to make notes about the evidence they were basing their assessment on, what they saw, what they heard, what questions they're still sitting with. And then we combined those total points for a score out of 15 and used a weighting to determine if the candidate was eligible to move forward, or whether we were recommending that candidate move forward. So if they scored, in the first that like 12 to 15 points, this was considered an exceptional candidate that was exceeding our expectations. And so we definitely knew we wanted to move them forward. If somebody had that sort of 10 to 12 ranking, we would consider them a strong candidate. Underneath that, it was either candidates met minimum criteria or the candidate didn't actually meet the minimum criteria. And so we could look at those combined points from each committee member, and we could look at that holistically. And that really helped to inform our debriefs and really helped to bring in the different perspectives on why certain committee members might have rated higher or lower than others. And that really generated a really great conversation. The third component to designing a rubric is offering the indicators to frame how the committee should use the rating scale. So this is just, providing some examples. You might see or you might hear, they might, have terms or language or examples that they might put in as you move through, and these would be indicators or evidence that that you can see and hear that allow them to create their assessment, to assign that number of points. So at the end of each round of interviews, what we recommend is really bringing that committee together for a debrief. And so you're actually looking at the assessments for each candidate and looking at those weighted rubrics overall to help to determine which candidates will move forward to the next round. So the rubric is really helpful because it creates a data set. So if we start to notice that you're getting into that territory that moves away from the KSAs or moves away from the key anchors or those criteria that you had developed, this brings you a chance to bring back to the data that's in front of you. You can provide a preliminary analysis of what you noticed as the person who was sort of aggregating all of that, or you can pull out from different people in the committee, what did you hear? What did you most respect about this candidate? What did you see? That question of what question do you still have, or what questions are you still holding about this candidate in relationship to this role? Super important, because that might shift the way that you move forward in the questions for the second round. So if you need to expand on something or go deeper on something, or you need to you're noticing a trend that, these candidates that we want to move forward, we still have these general questions about that. So how does that impact? How do we sort of iterate on that into that second round of interviews? So this is also a point where, you might have a plan for first round, second round, third round, but you might need to pause and just reassess and really confirm or validate that your next step is actually the next step that is informed by the data that you're receiving through these debrief conversations and these data sets you're receiving. The conversation around what challenged you or gave you pause, this is one of those things that was really interesting as we move through the 3 interviews. And part of the reason why we recommend that, that 3 interview model, because there may have been very few challenges for some folks in the first interview. They nailed all those answers. They were a really good performer. And then others that gave you pause. But then you might notice that those things are shifting, that you're starting to see different kinds of patterns come out as you move through. And so really sort of highlighting those weak signals in that first interview, and watch what gets stronger or what starts to fade away as you move through the different rounds of interviews will help you get a better grasp sort of a little bit more objectively on each candidate and their weighting overall in light of the role. And then finally, that question is, okay, based on your assessment, based on the group assessment, would you recommend this candidate move forward in the process? And this is really interesting. If you have scores that are really close together, this might be a really quick conversation. And if you have scores that are really far apart, this might take a little bit longer. And so it really does sort of bring you back to how are decisions made in this process, and how, are you driving for consensus, or is somebody going to be making the call? And if someone's making the call, how does the committee, work to trust and understand that way forward? So this is one of those places where distribution of power really shows up, and one of those places you can really watch just to see and get a kind of overall temperature or flavor for how the committee is working and how that process is moving. And you may have to adapt based on what you're learning or seeing in that phase. And that's about the rubric.
Katrina, what I really love about this is the guide that it provides, and often just like free roaming conversation. In the past, I've used like stoplight grading. When you get done, is it a red, yellow, or green? You're like green to put them
Hmm.
in the next round. Red, I don't think they match for this role, and then yellow, like I could go either way on this one. Um, or you do like the plus minus, or the which I guess is maybe just another way of doing stoplight grading.
Hmm.
But even in using those, even in coming into an interview process where the search committee members have been trained, like they've taken implicit attitudes tests, they've read
Hmm.
biases, like the 20 bias that'll screw up your decisions. They understand the questions you can and can't ask and why. Even with that, like it's still hard to like separate your bias from that conversation. What I love about the rubric is it like keeps reframing it to ground in those anchors, and
Hmm.
to adapt for that, to adapt for the bias. It doesn't eliminate the bias for it, but it adapts for the bias. And what's really cool about it is like a number of times I've seen how the committee comes in and sort of has their thinking, and then you sort of push on one part of that rubric, and like, oh right, that is what happened. And so you see a shuffling of the candidates in a different way that
Hmm.
realign them with how they individually connect to those KSAs and key anchors, and not what just happens in just life where you're like, you start rating them against each other. And
Hmm.
especially when you're like,
Hmm.
who went first because they're anchoring, or do you want to go, you want to go last because then you're last in the committee's memory, or you're freshest in the committee's minds. The rubric is that way of just like untangling some of that, and helping clarify the thinking around the decisions that you're making, to adapt for those just like natural tendencies that typically happen when a group of people get together to talk about who you should hire.
I think you're raising a really good point here, Tim, about, when these rubrics get used. And so, after you have an interview, immediately after that interview, while that conversation is fresh, is the time to use that rubric or to fill out that template. Because if you sit until the end, then exactly what you're talking about is happening. You're having that sort of availability bias of the last conversation and then trying to remember everybody else's answers sort of in light of that last answer. And that becomes the benchmark instead of the criteria that you've actually identified for each candidate. So that's one way that we can kind of troubleshoot against that happening or against that bias, or adjust for that bias, is by asking people to complete that rubric following it, kind of in that hour if they can, following that interview. And then they give you those scores, or they send those in and submit them, and then you have a chance to look at them. And I would say that, for the first one, it might be really useful to have people submit them to one person. And who that person is one of those things to pay attention to in terms of distribution of power, right? Because you want people to be able to give feedback or to say things that might not be um, shared, or they might be from their own personal kind of understanding or experience. And so how do you have somebody that's sort of neutral in the process really look at those, so that you can sort of ask questions based on what's there, but actually not necessarily attribute those comments to the people who filled out those forms, because that can also create a really you know tense dynamic if people feel like they're being called out for giving feedback that isn't actually shared by the rest of the committee. So there's a really delicate way to debrief this, but I think that was something that we really paid attention to in our Upper Philadelphia search, for example, because we knew that committee was representing so many different parts of the hierarchy and functional areas of the organization, and that there were power, historical kind of ways power played out within kind of those roles.
One of the things that's been sort of rolling around in my mind since our conversation was around sort of this three interview like framework that we
Mm.
encourage, and sort of the time it takes. And for me, it's been like, how might quote unquote three interviews show up in a process that aren't necessarily three interviews? And
Hmm.
how might this rubric look differently if you're hiring a CEO versus someone who's not a CEO? And like, how do you
Hmm.
use the same sort of framework but adapt it for carpenters or software engineers or whatever it might be? And I think that's where, because I think that's where a lot of creativity and cross pollination can occur. Oh, you're using that
Hmm.
for that. That's how you adapt that model for carpenters. Oh, that would be an interesting thing to adapt it for, whatever role. And so these are two things that have been really in my mind, especially as we think, as people mentioned yesterday, it's a hot labor market where like
Hmm.
time is not on the employer side because people have a lot of different options oftentimes. So like, how how do you take something that could be a 4 month long process and keep the essence of that thing intact, but use it in a different way that might be lighter weight or faster or whatever, as you're going through the process. And so those are things that I'm really intrigued to just like meditate on for a bit, because I think there's something in that leads to further iteration, that then forms any type of search that you're doing.
Yeah, totally. And one of the things that really struck me yesterday was um, around the comment of the funnel, right? Like if you're getting people just randomly apply or click and apply, and they don't have those basic KSAs that you need, that still takes time in that process. And so, that is also something that um, can add kind of angst to wanting to go through this in an interview kind of a space. And so maybe there's a way of designing a rubric that um, has as a first step just a way of if it's a screening call where you're not sure if this person has the kind of KSA, like how do you use that space, that 20 minutes, to help you get really quickly clear on whether this person can move into that next round where you might be able to answer some of the other questions you might need for that person, or um, you know that connects to another thing that we were thinking about, which is all of these different channels and how to apply and how you track all of those different things, which I think connects to our conversation around the applicant tracking systems. And so I wonder about you know what's possible there, and rethinking how that gets scoped out.
This concept of hurdles in the process, it was what was really on my mind yesterday when we were having that conversation, um, and things that employers might typically ask for: resume, cover letter, three
Hmm.
references, as a way, especially if they know that they're going to get a lot of applicants, to quickly weed through and pull people out of the process. And I've been a part of this before where I'm like, I know we're going to get 1,000 applicants for one job, one position. And we don't have, don't have the time to look at everyone's cover letter or resume in that way. And this was a number of years ago. And I'm look back and I'm like, Tim, what did you do? But one of the things we used as a hurdle was we asked for three references, and if people didn't include references, or they said they included the standard line references available upon
Hmm.
request, we kicked them out of the process. And today I look back and think,
Hmm.
God, I mean, how many talented candidates were in that pool that we put a hurdle in there that prevented them from getting into the process? And who was, so it's kind of like false negatives and false positives, like who made it
Hmm.
through that over that hurdle and who didn't. And so I think that's the tension that I have with, like, we have like real resource issues in organizations and bandwidth issues, and like
Hmm.
we can't oftentimes take 1,000 applicants or 10,000 applicants, but also recognizing there's a lot of great candidates in those pools, and like, what do you do with them? And that's one of the interesting things around, like, I've not used it. I've talked to colleagues who have asynchronous video interviews
Oh
as
yeah,
a
I've used
screener.
those. Hmm.
Yeah, have you?
Hmm.
What did you think? Like, how did it go? How did you use it?
We used them for lots of frontline staff, actually, interviews. And so it was just a way, and they could do it on the phone, on the computer, in any kind of method that they had available. And it was we used real, like, there was 2 questions or 3 questions. So it wasn't huge, and it was basically like, help us connect the dots um, to you and this role, and tell us a little bit about whatever this key anchor might be that we were really curious about. And so those made those were great in that you could watch all of those in a batch, and they were 2 to 5 minutes long, and so you might have spent 20 minutes doing a screening call, but you were getting this information in 5 minutes. Some were really funny, some were really trying to be really formal, and so you got this really interesting mix. And so I often wondered, what is the bias that I'm getting just watching this,
Mhm.
because you were watching them so quickly one after another. But it was also, right, like, it was a little bit of an extra step, and so people had to make a little bit of an effort, but um, they also didn't have to provide all the other stuff. And so I kind of often wondered about, if you're hiring, especially like a high number of, restaurant staff or housekeepers or, facilities folks, and you needed to bring a bunch of people into that process, it was a really great way to invite just little expressions of interest. And that kind of went a long way, right? So I don't know, if we didn't continue to use it. We sort of tried it as a pilot and didn't continue to use it for a bunch of reasons. But it was really intriguing. And I know that the companies that are doing that, like HireVue is one of them, the companies that are doing that are continuing to innovate that process. And so I'd be curious to sort of revisit it or hear if anybody else is using it right now, and how they're sort of interpreting its usefulness or its merit.
I know we're kind of reaching back to previous modules here, but it also aligns with this rubric and how we're
Hmm.
weighting. Um, it's something, we mentioned a couple modules ago around the open hiring process that Grayson Bakery and something
Hmm.
like Rhino Foods use, where if you put your name on the list, you get a job when it comes up to your name. And so, like, thinking about that and thinking about, like, how could you interview everyone who wants, everyone who applies, is something that I've like been noodling on for years. And it's something when I was at Fracturalis that our people team were really thinking, like, we get 500 applications. How could we interview every single one? And so after I
Hmm.
left, they tried the asynchronous videos and said it went really well. Um, and so I think it's an interesting thing. Like, maybe you can't do that, but how do you? Sorry, I've also known organizations who like done a 5-question quiz, and I'm not
Hmm.
sure how that like what that would be, but just other ways to try and get as if you the funnel as wide as possible and get that interest, and then also adapt for the bias along the way. So I
Hmm.
think you're right. There's a number of different um, tools out there that are worth experimenting with, and
Hmm.
just to see what happens. Um, and then sort of iterate from there. There are a number of tools that also are trying to make it easier, but I think are introducing other hurdles. And
Yeah.
so being mindful of, like, it might seem easier, it might be easier, but like, again, from a like, who's included here, who's excluded,
Hmm.
in using this tool, um, and weigh that against like your prior process or a traditional process. So I think that's one of the things that's so fun about this, is that there's like so many different ways you can approach, and it's going to be bespoke to the role you're hiring for, the organization, your values. But it's a really fun time to be in this process and
Hmm.
trying these different things out that ultimately will help you better align your process to the values that you hold in your organization.
Totally. I think one of the things this is making me think about at this point is, like, we used to go to a bunch of hiring fairs, or we used to go to schools and talk to those folks who are like at the apprenticeship phase, or we used to go to industry events and have a presence there. And so there were all of these ways, in the before times, where groups of people in similar work were sort of convening. And I don't know if those are happening, if they're starting up again, if people find them useful. But it was it was sort of this idea of, instead of making people come to you, as an organization, that there was some legwork there and some like effort there, and you know, and sometimes that building relationship in one of those quick conversations or in passing sort of brought a different kind of candidate in. We used to kind of laugh that there was always like, people, and they had their headphones on or their hoods up and they just wanted to like peruse and kind of, see what was out there without necessarily like putting themselves out there or engaging. Um, but at the same time, there were people who stopped to talk or who, would know that they were looking at, a few different, that there was a few different organizations that were represented there. And I know we also, used to do that with certain like international visa clauses, that people could bring in. And so we were looking internationally at recruitment programs. We were looking at the kind of career fair kind of spaces, those like conference spaces. We were looking at the training, those like upgrade PD credit kind of pieces that people were doing, and figuring out how do you kind of get a presence in some of those spaces. And so sometimes it was about like, you know, volunteering to give a short presentation or, talk about a career move that somebody in your organization had, and what their journey was, to just to inspire that like there's lots of ways to get here, or there's lots of ways that people can think about, finding at least a temporary home in an organization they might not have considered before.
Yeah, I think that sort of the mix and track, like mix up
Hmm.
your ways of connecting, and then track where you're getting people from. Because you talk about like those like fairs and like that's, oof, I just like get really nervous because
Hmm.
it's like a nightmare to be like in a room with like a lot of people I don't know and tables, and like, is this conversation going to be,
Especially
interesting,
now.
or am I, yeah, yeah, right. It's like, or am I going to be trapped for 20 minutes and then I can't pivot away from this? Um, and so like, but some people love it. Like, and like, so how do you mix these things up and then
Hmm.
try them and then see what works for specific positions in your organization, and then use that data later, and also maybe even provide, create a rubric for those, like,
Totally.
here's what we want to get from this, and how successful are we besides just
Hmm.
those sheer numbers. That might be, all right, we posted here, we got 200 applications, we went here, no one showed up at our table.
Yeah.
Um, so I think those are interesting ways to like, yeah, I know we sort of went back and sort of coming back again, but interesting ways of using tools throughout the process to rethink what your process looks like.
Yeah. Totally. And
And
that's
I
where like
think that,
taking a developmental evaluation approach is super useful, right? Because you're like, we're going to try something, we're going to get some data, we're going to like figure out what the implications are for us as we go forward, because it will be bespoke, right? We know that much in this moment, is that there's no, it's not replicable. There's no, I think as Kate said, like there's no silver bullet to this.
yeah, cool. Well, Katrina, thanks for the overview of rubrics, and I think that brings our chat here to a close. So we will be with you for module 4, and maybe another bonus video between now and then.